All right. Hi, everybody. If you are just joining us, we're going to get started here in just a couple seconds. We're going to give everyone a minute or so to find the stream, so just hang on for a minute. All right. Okay, it looks like we have a little bit of an audience, so we can go ahead and get started. We are super excited and thankful today. We have Mark Reiter, who's the Soils and Nutrient Management Specialist. He's at the Eastern Shore AREC. So actually, I'm going to ask him when he takes over to talk a little bit about what our agriculture research and extension centers are. I hope that's okay, because I just remembered that. So today we have Mark, who's going to talk about cover crops. Then next week, we are going to have Chris Mullins. Actually, again, he did one of these in the very beginning. And Chris is going to talk about ways you can extend your growing season using cold frames and row covers. So two kind of fall-winter transition gardening topics. And then after that, we're going to have one last in our little gardening series talking about some indoor plant propagation for the winter. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark.
Thank you, Devin. So welcome from the beautiful Eastern Shore of Virginia. As Devin mentioned, I'm Mark Reiter, and I'm the Soils and Nutrient Management Extension Specialist at the Eastern Shore Agriculture Research and Extension Center. So Virginia Tech has 11 ARECs, we call them, scattered around the state that each focus on the specific commodities for that region. So for instance, in the Suffolk area, we have an AREC that focuses on peanut production, cotton production. In Northern Virginia, there's an AREC that focuses on horse production. There's a AREC that focuses on tobacco production. So what we do is we specialize in these specific research and extension areas to help Virginia stakeholders improve their agricultural production for that specific region. However, we do serve the whole state. So hopefully I'm reaching some of you from far West Virginia or beyond as I join you here from the Eastern Shore. So our research station here on the Eastern Shore specifically focuses on vegetable crops such as tomatoes, snap beans, potatoes, sweet corn, lima beans, any type of fresh market vegetable commodity. And we also focus on traditional row crops that are in rotation with these crops, such as corn, soybeans, and wheat. So that's what we do here at the Eastern Shore AREC. So if you have any questions about AREC specifically or extension, feel free to call or email me. I'll give you my information here at the end. And of course, always contact your local Virginia Cooperative Extension agent too, as they have a direct line to those of us at ARECs as well for your specific questions. So with that, we'll take a look here at the topic at hand today, which is, of course, my favorite topic area, since I'm the soils and fertility person over here on the Eastern Shore, and that's the home garden. And we advertised that we're going to talk about cover crops, but it's really hard to talk about fall gardening and being successful without talking about soil testing. So we'll first talk about soil testing in your home garden, and then we'll convert to cover crops and why that's important. It might be useful for you in your home garden as well. On a commercial scale for commercial farmers, cover crops are almost becoming commonplace. They're really good for nutrient cycling, for soil health improvement, for water conservation. And so certainly anytime you can implement this on any scale, whether it's a small garden or a 1 acre garden or 5 acre garden, it can be certainly useful. So with that, we'll first take a look here at soil testing and talk about why it's important to really focus on nutrients and soil testing and fertilizers pretty much all year round, but especially as you're starting your garden here in the fall for fall crops. So there's 17 essential elements that you need to grow a successful crop. And this is always one of my trick questions I ask graduate students. What are the main elements that we need, that we see that crops need? And of course, that's carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which we get from the air and from water. But when you start looking at these other elements like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, and whatnot, these are elements that we typically apply with fertilizer. And soil testing is by far the best way to figure out which of these nutrients you need and how much you might need to be successful in your garden, to not only save money by not over applying what you don't need, but also to help reduce environmental problems that may come from applying too much phosphorus or too much nitrogen. So these are the essential elements. And with soil testing, and pretty much the bulk of my program regarding soil fertility focuses on something we call the law of the minimum, which basically, if you pretend that your soil is a barrel of water, if you have, say, each slide of a barrel is a different nutrient. And if you see the example here on the screen, the water or the yield of whatever crop you're growing is only going to fill up to that bottom slat. So in the example we have here, the nitrogen or the end slat is deficient. And so what the gardener or farmer or somebody managing turf should do is first apply nitrogen to this barrel to patch that hole. After that nitrogen barrel is patched, you then start focusing on the next limiting nutrient, such as phosphorus. And this is the basis of soil testing, is we help you figure out which nutrient is most needed to start meeting those most limiting factors. This is really important, again, to save money, but also just to help also reduce pollution from some environmentally sensitive nutrients. Something else we focus on with soil testing is pH. And of course, pH is just the amount of hydrogen ions or the amount of acid in your soil. And so any crop, any plant, any organism for the most part likes a pH somewhere between 5.8 and 6.8 to be most productive. And for most crops here in Virginia, for the gardener or for a commercial farmer, we like the pH to be somewhere between 6.2 and 6.5, meaning that we're almost neutral. And so if you take a look at this graph on the screen, the amount of pH or the amount of acid in our soil or the range of pH can really impact the amount of nutrients that are available. So for instance, looking at phosphorus is probably the most classic example. If your pH gets too low, say much below 5.8, 5.5, you start having iron and aluminum phosphates forming, and the phosphorus is not available to a plant. Phosphorus turns into a rock. On the flip side, if you overlime and your pH gets too high, phosphorus is also not available because the calcium phosphates form, again, it turns into a rock. And so I need to use my pointer here. Oops. I didn't practice on that. There we go. And so what we try to do is have our pH somewhere between 6 and 6.5, where most of these nutrients are most readily available. So that's one really useful component of soil pH. And also the reason we stress this so much and why we stress it on soil testing is because in Virginia, our soil is always trying to become more acid. Whether it's from the rain, which is a acidic pH of 5.6 or so, whether it's from our soil breaking down, aluminum being released, soil microbes and soil microbial activity can reduce soil pH, which is actually really pertinent when we're talking about cover crops, because more organic matter means you have more microbes cycling that in the soil, so your pH might tend to be lower. And also when you're applying fertilizer, many of the fertilizers themselves have a acidic pH as well. And so there's many different reasons, but overall in Virginia, we typically say you need to lime about every 2 to 3 years. So just keep that in mind when you're doing soil tests, that once you do it once, you're going to need to do it again in a year, 2 or 3, depending on how much lime and how much fertilizer, how much organic matter you have in your particular garden. So the soil test will do pH as well as nutrients, like we discussed. And it works in a broad range of soils. This is one of the really, I think, most unique things about soil testing compared to some other things that you might test in your labs, is whether you're working on a soil that's a very, we call, light colored, low organic matter, sandy loam texture versus something that might have a pH, organic matter of say 0.5%, to something dark, a lot of organic matter, maybe 5-6% organic matter. The same soil test calibrations that we use work pretty well on all these different soils. So it doesn't matter which part of Virginia you're watching this from, you certainly can use the Virginia Tech Soil Testing Lab to, or a private lab, to have some pretty nice results for your fertilizer predictions. And this is probably my second favorite slide to show. It really depends. When we're testing soil, we're basically just figuring out how much of these nutrients are stuck to your particular soil. So if you're on a sandy loam, you have less nutrients stuck, or a lower cation exchange capacity, we call it, to say if you're out in the Piedmont or Western Virginia, where you have more clay and more nutrients stuck to your soil. And one of the unique things about soil is that it's pretty hard to change, but over time you can change it by adding in more organic matter, say by using mulches, manures, or in the case for what we're going to talk about today, cover crops, to help slightly change your nutrient holding capacity and water holding capacity by adding more organic matter to that system. That's one of the very few ways that you can actually change, say, a sandy loam or a loamy sand like we have here on the Eastern Shore to hold more nutrients. It's by adding in organic matter. So when you're taking a soil test, the most important part, since our calibrations work pretty well for any soil, is to make sure you sample accurately. So this is a typical homeowner situation. You want to treat any area that's alike, or that you'll fertilize alike over time, the same, while avoiding small bad areas. So for instance, if you're doing your vegetable garden, you want to go across your garden, say take 10 or so soil cores, put them in a bucket, mix them together, and that's your one soil sample that you send to Virginia Tech or to your private lab. If you're doing areas, say around your house, like your yard, and you have bad spots where nothing's growing, take them separately, or certainly don't mix them in with your big sample, because something else is going on and you need to troubleshoot that area, but you don't want to skew your overall results. So this is the basis that you need to ensure that you're getting a good sample to get good data. And when you're taking a sample, the best thing to do is use a soil probe. So you take one depth throughout your 0 to 4 inch area. But if you don't have a probe, dig a hole and then make sure you take a sample of equal thickness out of your hole. That's because nutrients stratify over time, and we don't have time to talk about that today, but you want to make sure you're getting 0 to 4 or 0 to 6 inches, the same thickness from each depth for your soil sample from each of those 10 different areas that you mix together for your one sample. And then you send in a soil test sheet, which gives us more information about your information, so you can identify the sample, or whether you limed recently or not, and then what nutrient analysis you desire. And then you box that up and send it to Virginia Tech. And up there, we'll extract it. We'll add in some Malic 1 soil solution extract, shake it for 5 minutes, run it through the inductively coupled plasma atomic emission spectrophotometer. And from that, we'll develop you a soil test report telling you exactly how much extractable, say, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and whatnot is in your particular soil, and then also a recommendation on how much fertilizer you need. So certainly this is one thing you should consider, in my opinion, first when thinking about a fall garden, to make sure that you're getting the fertilizer out there that you need, so you can incorporate lime and whatnot before you actually plant your plants if it's needed. So with that being said, in true extension specialist fashion, I'm talking too much. And you're gonna run a little bit over here, but let's move on to cover crops now, where we just want to talk about overall soil health and soil quality and soil tilth. And there's a lot of different ambiguous terms out there, but overall what we try to do with soil management, and say it's no tillage on commercial crop production practices, or with using cover crops, is to improve that overall water movement in the soil, the ability to hold more water, the ability to hold more nutrients, and to basically make it healthier for a plant to grow. So in this example on the left, This is from the research station here on the shore, where it's been conventionally tilled, disc plowed and whatnot, 2-3 times a year for say at least 50 plus years since the station's been here, but probably longer because this was a farm before the station was built. And so as you can see, you think good tillage leads for water penetration, but that's not necessarily true, as the water did not flow through the soil. The aggregation's gone, the soil slides are gone, the macropores, wormholes are gone. But in the example on the right on the screen, this sample was taken from 30 feet away on the same type of soil, but had been under no tillage for 10 years. So within 10 years, enough organic matter and soil structure had built up to where water very quickly moved through the soil pores for aeration and overall better soil tilth and soil health. Another great example is the same thing, looking at how we talk about aggregates and how soils stick together. The left is the conventional tillage that's been disc and plowed for many, many years. It's basically individual soil pores, particles, which pack together, and of course pond water. And on the right is the good aggregation from the just no-till. And so our idea with cover crops are, since in Virginia, most garden soils are probably more like on the left, right? You go out there with a disc, a plow, or a rototiller and till it once, twice. I know in my home garden, I probably have tilled it, some parts 5-6 times this summer. So my soil structure is basically non-existent. So it's more like the photo here on the left. So the idea with maybe cover crops and organic matter is to help increase that overall soil structure more quickly. And there's a lot of different crops you can use. As far as the most common here, commonly in Virginia for row crop farmers and vegetable farmers, at least on large scales, are grasses, which can produce a lot of biomass in big plants. We won't focus too much on the carbon-nitrogen ratio, but it's pretty high, which means it's good for scavenging nutrients like nitrogen out of the soil, sucking them up, and then it holds them a really long time. But because of that high C/N ratio, it rots pretty slowly in, say, a garden situation to help protect that soil from weeds coming up. But with that, you might need a little bit more nitrogen over time to make sure your crops in your garden do have enough nitrogen fertilizer. There's legumes that are out there which produce less biomass, a lower carbon-nitrogen ratio, which means they rot quicker. So that nitrogen that is in that legume will rot faster, be more available to your plants more quickly, say maybe 2 to 3 weeks, 4 weeks versus 8 to 10 weeks or longer, like it would be for a grass. But I do caution you for legumes that some of these can be hard to kill. And they also might have something we call hard seed, which means if you plant them, even though you kill what comes up, over time, it might come up again as a weed because that hard seed will eventually grow. Brassicas, one of the more famous being planted right now, are like a canola, or this is actually a picture of a daikon radish, which if you're a gardener, it's a great radish to eat. It's an Asian species that's really nice as a salad. It's also good as a cover crop. It's intermediate biomass and C/N ratio. It's got a deep taproot, but again, it can be hard to kill, and can also have these hard seeds that can later become weeds. And also one thing you might see are mixes, which basically take these 3 different modes of actions, 3 different types of plants. You put them together to get a little bit of the benefits from each. So the grasses can scavenge nutrients, more biomass. Legumes can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, rot more quickly. And then your brassicas can help break up hard pans. So that's some things you might see when you're looking for cover crops. But ultimately what we're trying to do with the cover crop, especially with some of these brassicas, are increase biomass in the top for like weed suppression, but also really to scavenge nutrients from down in the soil. Let's say you put fertilizer in your garden, the plants didn't utilize it all, and so these roots will suck up all that extra nutrients, put them in plant material, and then you can recycle it the next year. Also, they're really good for hard pans. As you can see, these brassicas here, we dug a soil pit and mapped how they grew, and they can't really break through a hard pan like if it's too hard, but what brassicas are really good at is they'll kind of find these little softer areas or like micropores, stick a root in, and then grow and kind of like break that hard pan so other roots can penetrate over time. And it's pretty impressive to see how some of these work. This plant obviously hit the hard pan, it just grew over laterally until it found that soft spot, and then it broke through to where it could further scavenge nutrients, which adds organic matter deeper in your soil profile, but also help break that hard pan every time, which can be really useful for the home garden. As you think about a tiller goes, what, maybe 3-4 inches deep. This can certainly, what we call, deep till, deeper in your profile to let those roots penetrate. So with that, just kind of a take-home message here is only put out what you need. Make sure you soil test. Make sure you're not wasting fertilizer. You're not causing extra pollution. But also to make sure you're getting those nutrients that are needed, so you have a healthy crop. Also, do this over time with soil samples. I personally do it every year for my garden. We recommend at least every other year to make sure your lime and pH is kept up adequately. And also, especially with gardens, our soils there are typically beat up from this high tillage area. So cover crops can actually be useful for helping to quickly add organic matter. It might be a little easier than hauling in a bunch of mulch and compost, but certainly that works as well. But just think about your system. Every time you're adding something to it, say a cover crop, you're changing something else. So some of these cover crops, some things to look out for is if you have a lot of biomass on your ground, just make sure you're looking out for insects, for stink bugs, different things that might attack your plants early on. Just be prepared to manage that if you need to. But also it's great for pollinators. So there's give and takes with any of these different crops and adding it to your system. So with that, feel free to follow us on Facebook. We post information year round pertaining to vegetable crops, as well as some other things we do here at the Eastern Shore, AREC. And also here's my contact information if you want to discuss anything further, as well as feel free to call your local extension agent that are all a great wealth of knowledge in these areas. So with that, Devin, if there's any questions.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was awesome. Now, I personally have a lot of questions, but let me start here just by asking, so you till in your own home garden?
I do till, yes.
Okay, so first question, what is the advantage of cover crops versus mulch?
So for me, being a little lazy, I think one of the biggest advantages between cover crops and mulch is the cover crops grow in place, so you don't have to, of course, go buy anything and haul it there. But also, one of the key things about cover crops, one of the components that they're doing that mulch is not, is those roots are scavenging through the soil to capture, escape nitrogen, sulfur, potassium, and other nutrients that might be below your root zone. So just to give you an idea, a typical tomato plant, their roots only go, 90% of the roots are in the top 12 inches of your soil. So let's say you have a ammonium nitrate that you put on last year. That nitrate might have leached down to, say, 18 inches deep. Well, that's no longer accessible by your tomato plant. But if you plant a cover crop over winter, say a rye or a brassica, that root can easily reach that 18 or 20 inches, suck that nitrogen back up, bring it back to the top of the soil. And so you're effectively recycling that nitrogen nutrient, which is good environmentally because it's not leaching, but also saves you money over time. Because what you'll find is as you recycle these nutrients from down deep to the top, your soil test will actually improve as you catch a lot of those escape nutrients. Just for example, in a corn plot we have here, we actually have not applied any potassium fertilizer in 6 years with decent corn yields because there was so much potassium that was leached in our profile down deep that most crops were not getting. These cover crops are sucking that back up, bringing it back to the top, and we're reusing it. So that's probably the greatest benefit to cover crops versus mulches. But as far as like organic matter, I would say they're probably equal. So it's kind of the mode of action, the mechanism you're after when comparing the two.
That is so cool. Okay, so next question, how many times a year should you soil test? And then kind of as an add-on, should you be testing in your front yard and in your backyard?
So as far as soil testing, we recommend that you do it at least every 3 years on one piece of ground. So say you have a vegetable garden every 3 years. I do my garden every year just because it's a lot of work to put in a garden, and I want to make sure that I have everything in the soil that I possibly can for a successful year. I don't want to say phosphorus or potassium to be limiting, but at least every 3 years is our recommendation. So not more than once a year, but at least every 3 years. With 1 or 2 being okay. I mean, it's cheap. It's $10 a sample through Virginia Tech, so it's cheap enough insurance for me. But as far as whether to sample your backyard and front yard separate, it really depends on your situation. You think about land management zones, land management areas. Is if you're in a half-acre lot in a neighborhood and you treat your front yard the same, your backyard the same, you always have. There's no pine trees, there's no trees, everything's basically the same, then you can just do one sample for everything. The key with soil testing is when something changes, you want to submit a separate sample. So for instance, at my house, my front yard is mostly oak trees. So I sample that separate than my side yard, which is mostly pine trees, because pine trees are more acidic and typically go to a more acid-loving environment. So the pine trees need more lime than the oak trees, that part of the yard. So different things to consider. If everything's the same, one sample's fine, but anytime something changes, you need to send a different sample.
Okay, and now we have a question. Do cover crops encourage bugs in the garden? And then separate question, but kind of related. Can you follow up on what you said about cover crops being good for pollinators?
Yes. So cover crops can, anytime you change anything in your system, you're going to change something else. And when we started really working with these high biomass cover crops, where we're letting things get as tall as, say, my waist or my shoulders, I'm 6.5 foot tall. So we're talking, 4 to 5 feet tall cover crops. Just because of all that residue that was there, and some of the different species like Australian winter peas and vetches, we did have an influx of insect injury to our particular crops. So it is something to be very careful about. There's some documentation where slugs might be increased or diseases might be increased. So that's one thing to consider. Now with a home garden, I typically assume that you're working this into your land, tilling it under. If you're doing that, your chances of insects are much less. But if say you're just kind of beating it down to leave a mulch to keep weeds from coming up, then you might have some different insect damages, such as stink bugs, a good example, which attacked our corn here at the research station. So in that case, you might have to have some intervention with some sort of control spray or whatever kind of control you want to use for insects. Now on the flip side with that, because some of these species, especially like the mixed species, like where I have the grasses for nutrient assimilation from the soil, you have things with a lot of flowers like the brassicas, mustards, canolas, or some of the vetches. There's so many blooms that it's amazing to see the amount of pollinators out there early in the season that can be beneficial. Now, of course, if you have cover crops, your garden's not actively growing, but that's beneficial for just helping that pollinator situation occur. So one thing to consider might be leaving some cover crops to grow really big, on the borders of your garden. But if you do that, you might have some non-beneficial insects as well. So it's kind of a balancing act.
All right. Another question here. What is the best time of year to think about if you are doing soil testing and you need to add something? Should you do that in the fall or should you wait till the spring?
So largely, it does not matter if you're soil testing in the fall or the spring. The nutrients you can apply basically after you plant. It's not so difficult to do, but the largest thing to worry about is lime. Lime does not move very quickly. And so if say you have lime in your, say you have a low pH and you try to lime, you really need to work that into the soil to make sure that you have your soil profile pH raised because it moves very slow. And so I don't care as much about the timing, whether you take it in spring or the fall. If you need 1,000 pounds of lime, it's going to tell you need 1,000 pounds of lime. It doesn't matter. But you need to really pay attention to your management as far as when you can work that lime into the soil. Is what's important. So say for now, if you're planting broccoli or kale or something, you should soil test now to make sure that Well, you might have already missed the boat on that one, but you probably still can do some management with lime. But lime's the big factor, I guess.
Okay, we have a couple questions about resources. So one, is there a list, like a comprehensive list of potential cover crops for Virginia? Do you know if we have a publication like that?
We do not have a comprehensive publication that I know about, especially not towards home gardens. Now, the Virginia Natural Resources Conservation Service has a whole manual online, which is more targeted towards farmers. But we're also part of Virginia Tech. We're part of the Southern Cover Crop Council. And if you just Google, or I'm sorry, this is an extension, use your favorite search engine to find a Southern Cover Crop Council. There's a resource guide. And this guide, you can actually click on Virginia, and then it will let you, I forget the exact menu, click on row crops or vegetables, and it has all the different species that we recommend for Virginia, as well as seeding rates. Now that guide is targeted towards, per acre basis, but this is a live session. I would ask you how many of y'all know how many square feet per acre, but you can easily do the conversions knowing that 43,560 square foot is in 1 acre. So say we need 100 pounds per acre, well then just do your math to see how much you need for your garden. But that's an excellent resource that we're updating regularly. And actually, some things still say under construction, but I know the coastal plain of Virginia is complete. So, and that'll work for most of Virginia.
And that leads kind of perfectly into our next question, which is it possible to find cover crops at local garden centers? Or if you are wanting to attempt this, what kind of place should you be looking?
That is a very good question. I'm not sure. We buy all ours in bulk. We'll have to, I'll find that. Can I put this on the Facebook page after? Devin, we'll send, we'll get some more information for that. Some of your, I guess not big box stores, but typically garden centers should have some different things. If you go in and ask for daikon radish, or they probably won't have something like raw because that's not typical. But yeah, let me work on that. It's a good question.
I don't know if this, maybe people would want this tip, but Alex Hessler, he did one about transplanting, and he said if you're looking for like the industrial size seed starting plugs, go to your farmer's market and ask a farmer who looks like they would be helpful. So you could go.
There you go. That's perfect. Yep.
Ask a local farmer if they'll just give you a baggie. Yep. Okay, so
that would be a great thing to do.
Another question here. Someone wants to know if you have raised beds, different raised beds, should you be testing all of those separately? Should you be getting a sample from each of those and mixing them together? How should you approach raised beds?
Raised beds is just like any other area. If you're treating all your raised beds the same, I would test them all the same. Now, if you have one raised bed that's not performing well, or was built at a different time with different soil or something like that, I would sample it separately. Otherwise, you can do them okay. So.
All right, I think that answers all of the questions that we got. Let me just check here. Yeah, perfect. Okay, if anyone else has questions, we've been getting a lot of questions when people go back and watch these later at a later time. So if that applies to you and you're watching this in the future and not live and you have a question, if you could message it to the page instead of commenting on the video, that's a better way to make sure I see it. And then you can also always contact your local extension office and they will be able to answer specific things if you have specific questions. Oh, I do see we have one last question here. Is it necessary to test soil for containers?
I have, but I guess if you're talking by containers, is it more specific, like a container garden?
It seems like, yes, this person says they reuse the same soil and for container gardening.
Mm-hmm. We do have a soil test for that, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think
but I would not do the routine. There's a separate, if I remember correctly, a separate code you would put in. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
For containers.
That's a great question for your extension agent specifically. Yeah.
That is a good point. So yeah, slightly different process. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mark. This was super helpful. Oh, wait, now this person has followed up here. I do this now. We have done a whole presentation about container gardening. So you can watch that, and they do talk about changing out container soil. So that's what I'll say for that, to go to that container gardening specific presentation. But thank you so much, Mark. That was awesome. I'm going to try cover crops this year. I'm going to have to figure out where I can find some. And hopefully some of you all will as well. And this has been helpful to you. As I said, next week we're going to do another in our like transition to fall gardening kind of series here, talking about cold frames and row covers and some ways you can extend your growing season farther into the winter. So join us back here on Facebook next Thursday at 2. And thanks, Mark, again.
Thank you.